Welcome to another round of Sustainable You. And we have another entry in our spotlight. And today is all about food waste. So, how to identify food waste at home and beyond, how to mitigate food waste, how to utilize that household food to strengthen the soil, how to apply it as well, like tips in the kitchen, home gardens, and houseplants. So, lots of things to cover. And we have with us today Ali Wilson. And for the ones that may not know her yet, Ali is a senior program manager at Means Database. It's a food recovery nonprofit that works through the US so they can prevent food waste by increasing food donations. She has a master's degree in agroecology from the Federal University of Viçosa in Brazil. Did I pronounce that all right? Where she developed her understanding of agroecology, and in her free time volunteers with mutual aid organizations, all about focusing on that food security and food waste mitigation in the Jersey Shore community. She'll tell us more about in a minute. And we met through a community called Work on Climate. It's a very action-oriented Slack community for people that are serious about climate work. So if you are interested, join us over there. And you can follow Ali's adventures in LinkedIn. If you look Ali J. Wilson, that's really a tiny intro. So tell us, Ali, a bit more about yourself and what's the story behind your journey into permaculture.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Inez and Helen, for having me here. I'm super excited to talk about, getting food waste on the minds of people, especially when it comes to permaculture. I know that permaculturalists really focus on having it as close to a closed loop system as possible and having that self-sufficiency. And I think food waste is a big part of that. Just kind of give a little bit more background on me. I've been leaning into permaculture after a lot of really diverse and at some points very contradictory experiences in agriculture. My early career through my undergraduate degree in university was at a large state school here in the United States, where the main focus primarily was on industrialized agriculture. I was focusing on animal science, interested in learning about traditional agronomic practices, and a lot of my education in that specific institution focused on industrialized agriculture, vertical integration, and permaculture, agroecology, sustainable agriculture. It was talked about, but it wasn't focused on. A lot of my peers focused on sustainability at a very micro level. So when it came to talking about sustainable agriculture systems, they thought the most sustainable system was continuous monocultures, kind of trading out corn for soybeans every other season, which didn't really sound right to me. So through that experience, I kind of got involved with international agriculture and sustainable agricultural initiatives. I had a really great opportunity to travel abroad a lot and learn more about a bunch of different agroforestry systems, different agricultural practices in places like Uganda, Costa Rica, Brazil. And those diverse perspectives really taught me that this one particular thought of industrialized agriculture, it's not a one size fit all. And generally speaking, it's harmful for the planet. So that kind of led me into looking into an agroecological sphere of things, hence getting my master's, doing 2 years living in Brazil, learning about agroecological movements, permaculture, the importance of peasant movements and farmer movements. And that kind of led me back to the United States, focusing on food waste at my current position at Means, and really looking into how can we look at these systems that are currently producing waste today, such as the industrialized agriculture system in the United States, or even just the food system in general, and mitigating it, giving it to people who are in need, and also kind of creating more of a closed loop system from both an agroecological and permacultural mindset.
Yeah, I mean, it is crazy to think that, for example, forests have a 2% waste versus our cities that are much closer to an 80% waste. I mean, the strategies, the means, the ways, they exist. They've been evolving for almost 4 billion years. They are here, right? It's just that we have gone through this path, not looking at the whole system perspective, where social and natural capital are not accounted. And that's majority of why you'll tell us, but maybe some of the parts of where the waste gets generated. But yeah, so before we get more into the core and I divert us into somewhere we don't know, so tell us, whereabouts in the world are you? What sort of like climate zone are you in, so we can put this into perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm currently in USDA Planning Zone 7A. I'm right on the Jersey Shore in Monmouth County. I started putting in my raised beds the other day. I'm kind of a little behind on my seedlings and focusing on that. I have some tomatoes here, some lavender seedlings that I'm kind of having hope for, depending on how often I kind of keep an eye on them. But so the area that I live in right now is a primarily shore-based area. There's a lot of fishing. However, a little bit more inland, there is a big focus on agriculture. Here, there are a few permaculturalists in the area. There are a few people who are focusing on agroforestry systems and more diversified systems. The primary kind of focus around here is sod farming, so creating grass so then people can have nice green lawns that I think a lot of Americans idealize a little bit too much. And then, greenhouse and horticultural farming. Here in the summer, you'll see these really beautiful heirloom tomatoes that everyone's so excited to get out. This wheat corn that kind of goes all throughout. So the area of agriculture here is a little bit more diversified than, say, like the Midwest of the United States, where my education was kind of focused in the beginning of my career. So that's kind of the fun part of living around here. There's a lot of diversity, a lot of really interesting farmers, and just it's a really great community.
Yeah, that's really lovely to hear, isn't it? When we say that, I think on a couple of these spotlight sessions, where like it's really about the community coming together and building something different and exciting. Starts with one person, right?
And it's really great too because it's a very diversified community here. I grew up in a neighborhood where my neighbors were actually Italian immigrants, and my first kind of interaction with agriculture was, oh my God, they had these beautiful, like, diversified home garden. I would be like 5 years old, and like the tomatoes and the vines would like go up our fence. I would always ask, like, Mr. and Miss DeMeo, what's this? Like, how did you plant that? And they would tell me the whole story of it and just the beautiful diversity that they had. Like, looking back, it's a real privilege to have.
So then, as permaculture learners and practitioners today, we'd love to hear a bit more about your thoughts on the subject of food waste, or maybe we should call it food upcycling or scrap upcycling. Tell us about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the timing of this call is actually really interesting because here in the United States, we just wrapped up Food Waste Prevention Week, which is actually an initiative with a bunch of partners in the United States focusing on mitigating food waste, upcycling food waste, and looking at different ways that we could integrate it back into our systems. And I think when we talk about food waste, we all produce some level of food waste, whether that's cooking in your kitchen and, you're dicing garlic for your dinner tonight, and then you have like the garlic peels, or on an industrial level, there is waste when it comes to industrialized agriculture, which kind of is a big problem in terms of the current agri-food system that we have today. With permaculture systems, I think, there's this idea of making sure that you reuse the waste, making sure that any like food waste that is produced either goes into compost or is repurposed into just a myriad of things, not only turning it into a value add, but mitigating the idea of, these food scraps are just garbage now. No, that's a value added product that you could reintegrate into your system and add additional value to what you're creating. So since practitioners don't necessarily look for external inputs for fertilizers or other chemical inputs in permaculture, focusing on sustainability and self-sufficiently, using that food waste that is created in a permaculture system, that's a great way to make sure that you don't have to look for those artificial fertilizers or those other chemical inputs. Kind of reincorporating those back into your system as a value added product. So, for example, chicken eggs, if you have a permaculture system and you're fortunate enough to have laying hens, you're probably cooking with a lot of eggs in your house. At the end of the day, you're probably going to have a lot of eggshells that either go into the compost or, depending on where you are, you might just throw it out. One thing that I've been trying to do, and something that's really recommended, is taking those shells, drying them out, grinding them, and then adding them back into the soil. Because chicken eggs are essentially a form of calcium. Some birds themselves actually eat them to add calcium. So when we're looking at, basic soil chemistry, you really want to focus on those important nutrients that oftentimes you find in your food, whether that's nitrogen, potassium, calcium, phosphorus, all of those. So not only are you consuming them, but you're giving that consumption back to the soil. And it's such a great natural input. You could use leftover banana peels. So if you're in a system that is either producing bananas, or if you actually go out and get bananas and, consume them in your home, you could actually soak them in water for, I believe it's about 2 weeks. And then you could use that water as potassium fertilizer. So you grow up hearing about how potassium is so important, how you should eat a banana. Your soil could use that too. So food waste leftovers and just kind of food waste within a permaculture system could add so much nutrients to your soil, which then also helps your plants.
Yeah, I love the way you connect the dots so that we can really familiarize ourselves with it, because quite rightly, like, just as we need potassium and calcium and all these things, it's like we need to think of the wider picture. I was going to ask you a question around how you can kind of descale it from, farms into sort of the house and the plants that we have within our garden. But I think you've given some really good examples there, especially around chickens. And I do have a bit of a silly question though. How do you dry out eggshells and grind them up? That sounds quite time consuming.
So it really kind of depends, honestly. Like, I did it here the other day. I live in an apartment building right now, so these are also that's a perspective that I also think is important to think about when it comes to food waste. Like, a lot of us can't have a compost pile in our backyard. I don't have a backyard. I just have a few raised beds that my landlord let me put out front. So when it comes to waste solutions, you want to make sure that they're scalable, whether that's either in a micro scale, like you're mentioning, in your kitchen, or on a larger farm. So going back to the drying of chicken eggs, my roommate and I, we consume a lot of eggs in the morning. We just kind of collect them in a little takeout bin. And then I put it on a baking sheet, and then I bake it for a little bit until the shells get pretty crunchy. And then I just kind of either put them in a blender and they just kind of grind up themselves, or even you could crush it. And it's a good way to kind of turn it either into, it doesn't have to be a powder. It can be, that's a little bit more consumable for the soil and the microbiome that kind of exists in it. But just kind of making that a little bit more accessible, either chipping it down to half centimeter pieces right around there.
May I follow up on the egg situation? Why drying them out? I mean, there is some common practice out there as well, that if you find all chicken eggs or duck eggs or whatever, sometimes they hide the things and they become very old, not suitable for consumption. You could just literally break them down and put them on your raised beds and stuff. But any particular reason why would you dry them instead of just popping them in?
Yeah, I kind of do that just for a storage issue. So in terms of, living in an apartment or living in your home, it might be a little bit easier to store that. But like you said, it could easily be broken down to the soil the way that it is too. That's kind of a personal preference. If you have the ability to kind of put it in there immediately, that's even good too.
All right. So with the downscale it, and now I want to get perspective. So when you think about food waste in general, in the work that you do, what sort of confusions or which conflicts you see in the industry?
So I think the biggest one I see, both on a consumer level and even from, an industrialized level, is that waste always needs to be thrown out, which isn't necessarily the case. This translates into the corporate and business level with excess food. Whenever there's a large corporation that has, a certain item of food that, I'm not sure exactly what it's like it kind of differs in different countries, but here in the United States, we have a really confusing system where you have best by dates, you have use by dates, you have expiration dates, you have sell by dates, and all of this jargon as a consumer, and even for corporations, it's kind of confusing to determine when food is officially bad. So that produces a lot of waste and kind of prevents a lot of it creates a lot of food waste, and it prevents a lot of people from accessing that food. So you see a lot of these bigger organizations not only have this idea of, oh, I have pallets of waste and now I have to dispose of it. But even then, there's also some confusion on whether or not you could use it, if you could donate it. A lot of people fear about legality. So here in the United States, we have the Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Act and the Food Donation Improvement Act, which just passed recently. And those laws protect you from liability. So if I'm a larger organization, whether that's, a farm, a business, restaurant, grocery store, even catering companies, as long as I donate the food in good faith to a nonprofit or to an organization that, is giving this food to free for people in need, I'm okay. I'm not going to get sued because according to that law, I gave up my liability and I'm protected. So that's kind of when it comes to the donation side. In terms of the waste side, when it comes to composting and that type of thing, there's so much waste that's being produced, and sometimes there isn't the ability to compost it. There's a big gap when it comes to, commercial composting. And that is a huge issue, especially around here in different parts of the United States. And then, even just the creation of that waste too. When it comes to these big industrialized systems, there's this idea of, oh, we need to make sure that we chart our consumer base well enough so that we produce as much as we can, just in case our consumers have that much desire for this product. And that could be confusing because then you have, say, a bad month and, consumers are transitioning from, say, dairy milk to plant-based milk, then you have a whole bunch of excess from that. So making sure that, one, you're mitigating waste from even being produced in the first place by scaling and making sure that, you understand the market, you understand the amount of inputs that are put into it. So scaling the food waste so that you prevent it from being created. And then if the food waste is created and it's still, good food that people can consume, focusing on donating it. From there, feeding it to animals, pigs, chickens, depending on the type of food that you have access of, or depending on the type of food waste that you have, that could go to them. And that's a great way to kind of keep that within the system. Then composting and kind of bringing it back into the soil. Here in the US, our Environmental Protection Agency actually has a hierarchy on food waste. And that is a guide that people and businesses could actually use to determine, how to best mitigate their food waste and even prevent it.
Yeah, I love how you work from the source, right? So rather than looking downstream, you start from the beginning, what can be done in each step of the way. Really impressed with the new act that you mentioned, because like a decade ago, I was working on high retail sort of restaurant brand, and it broke my heart, the amount of stuff we'll put on the bin that was edible and it was fine. And I will have very tense conversations to be able to donate that food, get signature from charity saying, I waive, but give it to us, it'll be fine. And even like this, I did not manage to get an agreement in place. And it was very, very hard to see what was happening.
It's a difficult conversation.
Yeah. And like all the other steps, Helen can tell you more about her warmery. There are many things that you can do with food.
Yeah, I mean, I was inspired by some YouTubers who had got an old bath. So we managed to get an old bath from a neighbour and basically filled it with, do a bit of experiment with donkey manure and then old compost, but then layering it just with all our food scraps, and the worms love it. Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, it's quite exciting. And I don't know if you have this in the States or not, but a lot of the local councils in our area, but also in bringing it into London as well and some other areas across the UK, they do recycling like baskets, so food recycling. So you put your scraps in, they'll actually come and pick it up and create, the council's compost. So for your garden, they sell it back to you. Do you have that in the States? Or
I think it depends. So here it really depends on the municipality that you're in. A lot of the ones, so for example, where I live right now, we don't have like municipal composting. We actually pay for, like, I have, a contact with a local food waste recycling organization called Unwaste, and they have a really great service where they give you a bin, and then it's a subscription where they come and actually pick up the waste and then do the organics recycling. And there are a few community farms around here where you can bring your compost. It's not in a lot of areas of the United States, generally speaking, it's not as government, focused. In some kind of more urban areas, they do have some organics recycling, but it's not at the level that it could be. So I think that's also a big aspect too of, working with municipal governments, working with state governments, and really having people focus on, food waste, because the majority of the trash that you produce in your home is food waste, and it could be either composted or go into an organics recycling system. And there's a lot of opportunity with that. And with your worm idea, there's so much innovation when it comes to food waste, because there's so many ways that you could turn it into either a value added product or kind of mitigating it in so many different things. And I think that's something that's also really kind of exciting in terms of talking about food waste, because everybody makes food waste, and everyone can kind of find different ways to go about it and different ways to kind of either mitigate that or utilize it. And that's the fun, creative part of it too.
Yeah, it's always like a magic trick. You put the food waste in, the worms or whatever eats it, it biodegrades, and then you have this gold dust, and it's just, it's amazing. I sort of have years of now, why didn't I do this before? But yeah, no, that's great to hear. Anyway, so coming back to a bit more of kind of the details around it, and what are the key items to keep in mind when getting started with food waste there? And are there some bits that you can share with us?
Absolutely. So I think with the different things that we're talking about here, the number one thing to start off with is looking at your food waste, looking at what you produce in your home, what type of food waste you're producing. Do you eat a lot of eggs? Do you have, a lot of eggshells around? Or do you cook with a lot of vegetable scraps? Do you have a bunch of vegetable scraps at the end of cooking something? And then measuring it too. So how many pounds of food waste am I producing in a week? This kind of called a food waste audit, and understanding how you in your house or in your system produce the food waste, and also if there's a way to kind of identify how much, whether that's weighing the amount of food waste that you have, or even just keeping note of it, either through, looking at your garbage, measuring it. I know people who even weigh their garbage to determine how much food waste is produced compared to other waste. And then once you get an idea of the food waste that you're producing and how much of it, think about how you could limit it at the beginning. So think about the food that you're buying. If you're doing takeout, if, you're in a specific system where you're producing a lot of stuff and you might not even be using it or cooking it. I think all of us have the similar experience of either putting produce in the little shelf in your fridge, closing that shelf and then forgetting about it, or kind of shoving your leftovers into the back of your fridge. You sit there and you're like, oh, I'm doing such a great job. And then you clean out your fridge and you find like that old carrot that you completely forgot about. So limiting your food waste at the beginning, think about the food that you're buying too. And this could be tricky, especially if you have, a family with kids, looking at, the consumer preference in your household. With kids, they kind of change their ideas on what they like depending on the day. So kind of keeping that in mind. So thinking about the food that you're buying, how you're using it too, how you're storing it as well. So making sure that you're storing carrots in water to kind of make sure that they stay fresh and crunchy. Same thing with celery as well, because if you think about like the cell walls of a plant, if you kind of keep it out in the air, it's not really going to keep as well. And really kind of doing that homework yourself, because, it's a consumer preference and it's personal preference. So understanding what you like to eat, how you could keep it fresh, and how you will keep on utilizing it, that's kind of a fun little experiment that you get to have. And also how you could use traditional waste in your cooking. I've become very obsessed with collecting vegetable scraps. I have a little silicone bag that I collect all my veggie scraps in every time that I cook. I seal it, put it in the freezer, and then about once a month, I make vegetable broth, where I just use those vegetable scraps, stick it in a big pot, pour some water, add some seasonings, boil that, and then strain it out. And I freeze that vegetable stock so that anytime that I'm cooking, whether that's making chili, making soup, or even using it as like a brine or a pasta sauce, that I always have that on hand. And you get really creative with it and have a lot of fun with it. Another thing that I really like to do is actually kind of have like a chopped moment or like a master chef moment where you look in your fridge or you look in, the excess that you're producing and figure out, okay, I have 5 peppers that are about to go to waste. I know that I have a bunch of basil growing outside from the plant. Like, how can I use these ingredients to make a meal and utilize everything that I have? So that's kind of a fun little challenge that you could do.
I really love the idea. I can kind of imagine it, picture the moment, but I think it's great. And if we can encourage people to do this, it's great. Make it into a game.
Yeah, absolutely. Make it into a game. And you know what? Talk with your friends and neighbors too. So once you get an idea of the waste that you produce, reach out to people around you because, especially people of different generations or different cultures, they're going to have completely different ways of storing and utilizing that food waste. And then it's not even a matter of waste. It's, once again, pivoting from this idea of waste and turning it into an asset. And, just kind of wrap up on this too, see what's happening in your community. I'm fortunate enough to live in an area with organic recycling programs, with composters, and even, mutual aid organizations where they actually collect food from farmers that was going to be thrown away or that was going to be composted. And now they give out this food for free. And a lot of the mutual aid organizations, you don't have to show, proof of ID or proof of income. You could just go and say, hey, I'm looking for some food. And they'll give you like carrots, apples, really fresh, amazing food that would otherwise be thrown away.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And in fact, I think I noticed, we don't often go to the supermarket. We try and shop locally. But when I was staying up with my mum's the other day, she came home with a box and she was super excited. She came home with a box of all sorts of different things in there and was like, it's amazing. I got this whole box for £1 simply because it was just going to be chucked out and there was absolutely nothing wrong with it. And it was such a lovely idea, but stuff like that is really inspiring. I'm glad to hear that it's happening all over the place, which is very good. Okay, so you've talked a lot about food waste. You've talked about weighing, kind of the analytical data side of it. Talk to us a bit more about the benefits of tackling your own food waste.
Absolutely. So I think you just kind of touched upon it there. You're saving money and becoming aware of your food system. We throw out so much food and, think about how much money you spend on groceries, especially now considering, the price of inflation, which the cost of food, I think, is a main reason why a lot of permaculturalists turn to permaculture, having autonomy and the ability to kind of determine, how much, input you put into your food. And I think, as people who are involved in permaculture, how much time, money, blood, sweat, and tears goes into making that food. And taking a moment to look and say, oh man, I've been throwing out so much food in my own home, but I know how hard it is to grow that food. So not only are you saving money, stopping yourself from throwing out food, you're becoming more aware of your food system. You're going to reduce and reutilize waste in your home to make value added products, whether that's making, bone broth, vegetable broth, even like something that I kind of found from a chef that I was living with during my master's degree. I think a lot of us, when it comes to leeks, we only really eat like the white, light green kind of core, right? And then like the leaves of it, the darker green leaves, which are so tasty and so filled with amazing nutrients, we throw that away. You could literally chop that up and then mix it into a salad. You could have it with your omelet. I love having it for breakfast, like sprinkle it on top of an egg. You're reutilizing waste in your home and adding additional nutrients to your meals. And speaking of nutrients, you're adding nutrients to your gardens and houseplants too, whether that's, focusing on eggshells, coffee grounds, water from bananas. And if you have a composter, if you're fortunate enough to have land where you do a compost pile, you could do that as well and really reintroduce those nutrients back into your soil and as a result back into your food.
You know what? It's funny you bring up leeks because I remember the first time I saw how big an actual leek was when you took it out of the ground. And I was absolutely, horrified actually, because you're right. You have, I think they almost cut half the leek already when it goes into the supermarket. And then when you buy it, like you say, you take it home. And then for some bizarre reason, we cut off the bit that doesn't look as tasty when actually it's really good. Great call out. So Inna saying this to me as well, that growing your own food is like growing your own money, right? Because
this is guerrilla gardener. That's so true.
Oh, is it? Yeah. It's and it is true because you go outside and you're like, oh, what shall I have for dinner tonight? And you just pick, and it's like free food, which is really lovely.
Absolutely, and you could actually grow back a lot of food. So like I'm growing bok choy right now from like bok choy that I was using before, green onions, even potatoes. Like whenever you have old potatoes that, you kind of forgot about, either you threw them into the back of the cabinet or, you add them with an onion, they start sprouting. You could regrow them. Same thing with ginger and a lot of root vegetables as well.
We haven't managed to do the ginger thing. So if you have a tip of how to do it with the ginger, because we tried a couple of times and it's just not sprouting. And here we are zone 8B, I think. So it's slightly different, but not that different.
Yeah, I'm working on it. So like I saw some tips on making sure that you start inside and that you keep it moist so that, the roots are stimulated. I'm early on in the process. If I get to it, Inez, I'll let you know.
All right.
Okay, yeah, okay, right. So I'm sure that people would love to know a little bit more about what works and what doesn't work, in relation to some of your benefits.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that it really varies, kind of like we talked about on this call. Like each and every time we bring up one topic, someone else is like, oh, I do it this way, I do it that way. And I think that's something really great about food waste reduction. It's very personal. I think it's similar to permaculture methods. You kind of find what works for you, you utilize it. And if you try something and it doesn't work, like, for example, resprouting ginger, you give it a shot. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But there's always new ideas that are coming up. If you have the ability to compost, make your own compost, or if you find like a local composter in your area, you could work with that. So I think it's really individualized and it really focuses on, reaching out to people in your community and finding what works for you, finding what works for your neighbors, applying it to your system, seeing if that works. And if it doesn't, having patience. I think a lot of permaculturalists have tried many things that, it looks great when your neighbor does it. And for some reason, it doesn't work when you do it. And you could either decide to keep trying it until it works or, looking for something that ends up working better for you.
It sort of makes me think about diversity, right? And we touched this in the past. You mentioned the importance of diversify, and that's ecology, also financially. If I put my biomimicry hat on, it makes me think of how is nature resilient, and nature does it by variation, diversity, by redundancy. We tend to think about redundancy as a bad thing, and in fact, no, it's a good thing. So, so what's your take on this? I know we are maybe moving slightly far away from food waste per se, but
I really like this question. I think when it comes to diversification, when we talk about food waste, looking at it from like an ecological perspective, in nature, there isn't necessarily waste. Waste is always reused, whether that's, dead leaves falling from a tree, turning into kind of like a mulch, adding additional nutrients into the soil, etc. I think when it comes to diversification of food waste, it kind of goes back to what we're talking about in terms of diversification of thought and approach when it comes to either mitigating food waste, preventing food waste to begin with, and finding solutions for it. And working with the agro ecosystem that you live in. So as someone who is currently an apartment dweller, the agro ecosystem that, I'm even able to interact with, it's a completely different agro ecosystem than where you are right now, Inez and Helen, where you have land, where you have those resources, and kind of having the ability to adapt and work with the ecosystem that you're working in, the diversified practices that you could engage in limiting food waste and kind of reintroducing that into the ecological system that you're in. So yeah, just being able to adapt and diversify your approaches. And that could either be, finding out different ways to utilize your food waste in your kitchen or even in your community, finding different collaborators to work with, whether they do composting in their backyard. Some cities, do have a compost certification, like Tampa, Florida. They have a system where you actually could get assistance with building your own composter. You just have to watch like a webinar and do a training session. So the diversification of thought, environment, and the adaptability when it comes to this conversation around food waste, I think it's something really great to talk about.
Yeah, it also makes me think about this idea of like breaking through boundaries, like breaking free from some of the boundaries that we put ourselves into, or the access to land, right? Not everybody has a back garden or whatever. What are the other, how can you expand? What is the community? What are the spaces unutilized? Community gardens. I did some project work years ago about community garden spaces, some forgotten areas in London, right? So what can you do? What can you tap into? What is the potential already existing that you can, diversify around you? So context is everything, as you said.
Yeah, context is everything, and talking to your neighbors and getting to know your community. I think, when it comes to systems thinking, you enter it thinking, oh, I have to figure out everything in this system. And if I don't do it as the rugged individual, the world's going to fall apart. And that's not the case. I think there's this idea of competition versus collaboration. And there is a need for collaboration and communication. And once you get out of that mindset of, oh, I have to build a composter in my backyard. Ooh, I don't have one. I live in an apartment. I guess I'm going to individually do micro composting in my kitchen, even though maybe my roommate thinks worms are disgusting. Like finding those different things and reaching out to your community, because we're living in an ecosystem. No one is living and working in a vacuum. And that is especially true when it comes to food waste.
Great point to close it off today. Thank you so much, Ali, to spend this time with us. And all of you, obviously, we invent these things to share and pass on the knowledge and improve and tap into each other's ideas and to grow those ones. So stay tuned. Another video in 2 weeks of Sustainable You. And thank you ever so much once again, Ali.
Yeah, thank you all. This was so much fun.